welcome to the Huddle Breakdown with me, Laura Bradburn. James and Alan, I'm glad that you could join me. Unfortunately, I've spent the last week getting called all sorts, Lady of the Night, the oldest profession in the world, all sorts, because of my choice of language last week, and people have seen fit to take free aim at me. I don't know where it's come from. James, I'm my worst enemy at times, my own worst enemy.
Well, I would agree, and I can relate to that, but also Celtic were harlots this past week with their scoring. I mean, just very loose with their finishing. So I think let's keep the theme going.
Oh, I thought you meant scored so many goals and we couldn't get enough, but that's a whole other.
I guess it depends on one's perspective. If you're married to me, anything is too much.
Let's not go there. Let's not go there.
My poor wife, long suffering.
Alan, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right. You see, the difference is when you self-identify, Laura, and especially in such colourful yet archaic language, then it just opens the door. I mean, I hope you saw the poem, dedicated to you.
I did. Do you know there was a couple of details in that absolutely terrified the life out of me? Some very specific. Okay. Some very specific details that only certain people would know, and I was like, have I met this person before?
Well, Oscar Wilde.
Who knows?
That would be quite something.
Oh, but anyway, I guess everything's on the internet these days, isn't it? I'm probably somewhere. But anyway, enough about my potentially lurid past, and let's go on to the football. James, I was just saying before we came on, I had the pleasure of attending two of the matches recently, the Dundee match and then the Raith Rovers match. A combined 11 goals between them. You've obviously watched them yourself as well. We'll go for the Raith Rovers match because obviously you will have covered the Dundee match in some detail, I'm sure, elsewhere. But what did you make of that Raith Rovers performance and our performance against them to get through to the next round of the Scottish Cup?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the entertainment value is always there when you score that number of goals, and it's related to great finishing. I mean, that's just kind of classic supporter awesomeness. So that we always love that, just from a consumption perspective. As far as like the underlying stuff, and this is that we have to be our downer selves and talk about how Raith is a lower championship club. They had actually overperformed last season. I had commented about that a long time ago when I think it was Graham Spears had the manager right at the height of their dispersion between results versus underlying on Graham's podcast. And that was like the death nail. They kind of fell off a cliff after that. And then he was not long for the job some months later. So, Raith, not that great. It was like an as expected performance, like with the number of changes that we had, rotating smartly. Yay. Early stage cup competition against a lower league competitor. Let's get a bunch of guys in there, some minutes. I'd love to see that, particularly with the big game coming up on Wednesday. So yeah, I think all around as expected, and that's a good thing given the amount of rotation.
Yeah, I mean, it was there was a fair amount more rotation against Raith Rovers than even I was expecting, because I do think there's a little bit of a balance to be struck between resting players appropriately and obviously keeping them match sharp. But I suppose that's a conversation we can delve into a bit later. Alan, what was your thoughts on the match overall before we delve into some of the specifics?
Yeah, I mean, we probably should have gone full strength given how difficult it is to play against mid-table championship sides. I was disappointed to see McGregor starting. I think that was the only thing. But other than that, it was actually very noticeable if you look at the data. So this was one of these games, right, where the actual match data is not really very impressive because it didn't need to be, right? You score an early goal, the opposition have got virtually no threat. You then get one just before half time. It pretty much kills the game. They still don't really have much threat. And basically, you can win the game without really exerting yourself to any great degree. And you had half the players, the ones that don't normally play, putting in a pretty decent shift. The likes of Ralston and obviously Murray and Schlupp trying to get up to fitness, and Yang and McCowan. They're all trying really, really hard, and then you got the rest of them that are kind of we'll just there's a player over there. I'll just pass it to them. I'm not really going to, think too hard about that. So, the packing scores were down. The XG wasn't particularly high, but it didn't really matter. It just didn't matter. The job was done. Lots of players got minutes that enjoyed it and needed them. Apart from Ida, of course, didn't realise that he was going to be able to play on Wednesday, so he got a full 90 minutes, didn't he? So it was a very satisfactory performance, satisfactory result. As I say, the more impressive performances were those that come in and wanted to prove a point to themselves. Some of them really just kind of went through the motions, more or less, because, but it all worked out absolutely fine, and that's good, because as we saw, that isn't inevitably going to be the case.
Yeah, that Maeda point is a good one, although I would counter that perhaps if there's one player who we can afford to play for 90 minutes, not realising they're going to need to play again very soon after, it's probably Daisen Maeda. Don't think he'll struggle with that. Alan, I'll come back to you on it because you raised them. There's a lot of debate going on at the moment around the front line and what our strongest front three would be. Obviously, we started against Raith Rovers with, I think it was Yang, Maeda and Kuhn. My personal preferred front three, once they're all at full fitness, would be Jota on the left, Kuhn on the right and Maeda through the middle. How much merit do you think there is to this discussion around potentially Maeda becoming perhaps first choice sort of number 9, if you like, for us going forward?
Well, I've always been in that school of thought that is his best position. He doesn't really show many of the attributes of a creative wide forward, or indeed any, one might argue. But other than being a good decision maker, and this is the thing that people kind of struggle to reconcile in their heads, the fact that he can be so comically bad technically in terms of his final delivery, versus the fact he's a really good decision maker. So when it does come off, he generally is on the back of the right decision. This is the piece that I did a while ago on sort of winger IQ, trying to really. It was an experimental piece. I'm not saying it's definitive. It's not. It was a kind of, does this make sense piece? Put out a load of metrics under the banner of, do these metrics highlight, IQ in the way that player plays? I wasn't trying to say this is the best player, or this is the most productive player, or this is the best compiler, or I wasn't trying to say any of that. I was just trying to say which players in the wide areas show, game intelligence, really. And Maeda did very well by those metrics. So, he can play him out there, and he has been effective, obviously. But I just think he's you get more out of his pressing. If you play him in the middle. And, I think although he's not the most elegant of finishers, he's pretty calm and he's pretty deadly in front of goal. And, he was top scorer in the J League the season he played striker for the whole season. So, he has got a track record there. So, he would be my first choice, mainly because if you look at I agree with you in terms of the three that you stated, but I think it's a nice problem to have if you've got Maeda and Ida as well. Because he started to hone his game more in the way that we wanted him to in terms of simplifying it. So that's all good as well. So listen, going into the last business end of the season, as they say, that's going to be hopefully a nice problem to have.
He nearly did the same stumble that my dad does. He now can't distinguish between whether he's talking about Ida or Maeda, and he ends up saying Maeda at some point. It's a difficult one, which I'll give him some grace for, which is more than I normally do. Sorry, Dad, if you're watching. James, the argument, and Alan touched on it there about how good Maeda's pressing is and how valuable that could be to us through the middle. Obviously, that means that there are the James Taverniers of the world who will be less terrorised without a Maeda on the left-hand side. How much do you think we lose from putting Maeda through the middle compared to how much we gain in terms of where his strengths and weaknesses lie?
Yeah, I think some of that has to do with kind of general construction of the squad. So as we've recounted and belabored over and over again about the relative weakness of our left side. So his ability to track back as that kind of, like half space left-sided forward, meaning that he's not, thankfully, he's not one that we put out on the touchline to the extreme width and then expect him to do a lot from a ball progression perspective or creatively from wide areas. So he's usually kind of in that left half space as we nerds like to call it. So that puts him kind of in an ideal slot to track back and help with, let's say, Hatate and Greg Taylor, who are also oftentimes kind of in that channel of defending. So, and until that relative weakness is addressed, then, moving, there are some, like everything else, there's pluses and minuses in making some switches. So I think there is some uncertainty with the incremental positive you would get from him pressing center backs, for example, and, doing his ambush tracking back on midfielders centrally, which, one could argue would possibly cause more chaos against opponents. Would that offset the vulnerability we might have to, let's say, have a Jota out there who's not anywhere near that level in tracking back and defending with, would that create one of Alan's patented toxic combinations of 3 layers of below standard defending? So it's an interesting question. I don't think we can really know with any certainty until it would get tried. I'm not sure Wednesday's the time to experiment with that, so we'll get onto that. But the stress tested under those conditions. But I mean, I would like to see it. And again, given the nature of the rest of the season, whether it's a conversation around youth players getting minutes, et cetera. I mean, this is the quintessential timeline of games where there should be ample minutes to try things and to do it without relative jeopardy. So I say, give it a shot against a couple, do it against Hibs, do it against Hearts, do it against Aberdeen, a little bit better quality domestic opposition, and see how it goes, kind of thing.
James, at the risk of incurring the wrath of a certain section of the support, I would suggest that trying things out and see how they go would apply to Yang and his starting the game against Raith Rovers. Before we get Alan's thoughts on it, you and I had a brief discussion earlier today about it, and I expressed the opinion that despite the fact he had an assist and a fantastic goal, I have to admit, I didn't think he was much better than I've seen him previously. Still a lot of kind of running into dead ends and things of that nature, taking people on but with no end product, all the kind of cliches that we've talked about before. He's obviously been getting a lot of praise because of the things that he did right against Raith Rovers. What's your opinion on trying to assess how good a player is when we have such a variation and fluctuation in the opposition that we face?
From an analytical perspective, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, that's about trying to quantify the level of opposition and getting sample size. And that's what we always talk about, sample size. So Yang now has a pretty decent amount of time at Celtic, and then he's got all of his time in South Korea before that. So to kind of handpick out one game against lower league competition and try to extrapolate that into anything, I would say would be, relatively unwise from just from a process perspective of analyzing something. So yeah, I mean, it's, I declared a while back that I love watching him now because I don't expect that much in the final third, and he's such a kind of high energy, exciting player. He's got all those little tricks and movements, and like he's a fun guy to watch if you don't have those expectations. And then when he does deliver in a game like this, I mean, it really was kind of a joyous thing to witness. But I don't think that's any kind of turning the corner unless he starts to do it with some relative consistency and against higher level opposition. So, there's this thing, and when you're doing a statistical analysis, a lot of times you'll chop off the outliers to get a better sample. And so this would be one I would chop off. It's like, Raith Rovers, he had this great game. You don't wash it from history, and everyone enjoyed it, but it's not something that I would extrapolate into the future. Sans more evidence.
Evidence. I do believe he has the requisite, what is it, Alan, 900 minutes that they need to get before you can give them a base assessment. Yang has obviously by far and away reached that milestone. I guess the strange thing for me, Alan, is without much evidence, people still seem to be willing him to do well in a way that I think we don't always get with certain players. Some players get written off very quickly, others don't. I think the Celtic support en masse were delighted to see the way that he performed against Raith Rovers and are willing him to do that on a more regular basis.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to like about him individually as a professional, on a professional basis, and in terms of, we try and look at players in a 360 way here. We don't, that's why I would never. It's never completely black or completely white. There's certain things that players are good at, certain things less good at, and that's what we try and kind of draw out really. And there's no evidence that he isn't anything but a model professional who gives all the effort you'd want, who's diligent in terms of his team play, and I mean by that in terms of keeping the shape, following orders, kind of being where he's supposed to be on the pitch, tracking back, doing all the dirty stuff. None of that is an issue. None of that is a concern. And in some respects, he's actually pretty effective as a defensive winger. He's actually quite good. But at Celtic, if you're going to be one of the three forwards, you're going to get judged on what you produce in the final third. And it just simply isn't there. And he's gone from being somebody who's incredibly wasteful and tries things and they just don't seem to come off. And that really comes down to IQ mainly, because he's got a bit of pace and he's got a bit of technical skill, but he doesn't seem to be able to deploy it in the moment at that level, under that pressure, at that speed. And therefore what he's reverted to is becoming a very safe player on the ball, and he simply doesn't put enough risk into the game. And this was the risk in the Raith Rovers game, where you really only had Kuhn and McCowan that were trying to do the risky things on the ball, and everyone else was being quite safe. Even the centre-backs, and listen, I'm not going to criticise Dane Murray. Dane Murray had a phenomenal amount of the ball and didn't actually break the lines very often, but part of that was a function of how deep and compact Raith Rovers were. And even at 2-0, they're still taking time over goal kicks. They're still, because they just don't want to get hammered. So there wasn't a lot of space to be expansive. But then there wasn't, so I'm not going to criticise them for that. But the point being that even when you play a team like Raith Rovers, you've got to have players prepared to put risk into the game. Now, it all worked out well for him. He got 2 assists and a goal, Yang, and that was a great day for him. But as James says, if you were to kind of look at the, we came up in the conversation on the huddlebreakdown.com chat, and I made the point that probably the biggest impact on performance of Celtic players going back years is the standard of the opposition, because the differentiation between playing a Raith Rovers and then a Bayern Munich, as we're about to find out, is enormous, and very few teams in Europe have that disparate that breadth of that range of talent that they face in the teams over a season. So and really that I think I did a piece, and it was a while ago, and it was probably again one of these experimental pieces, and I'm not going to die on the hill of standing by the findings, but broadly speaking, using a pretty crude analysis, I worked out that on average, Celtic attacking players were about 40% less productive in Champions League than they were in the SPFL, which was a very broad statement there. There was a lot of variances, and actually Jota was the one that had least variance between his domestic performances and his Champions League performances, which is encouraging. But anyway, the point being that overall, there's a huge difference in output, really, in productivity, depending on the quality of the opposition that you're playing. And hence, coming back to Yang, as James says, you're delighted for him because of all the things that I've said. The fact that he's likable, he seems likable as a guy, and he seems to be a good teammate, and he clearly is putting the effort in. So you want him to win, you want him to succeed. So you're glad that he's had a game where I actually had him as man of the match, not for any sentimental reasons. He just stacked up the best numbers for me, and he made the difference when it mattered. As in, his contributions were key to kind of winning the game. So and that's great. That's probably the first time that's happened, and he had the highest packing score as well. So it was genuinely a very good performance, but there's no evidence that you can reproduce that level of attacking contribution, especially against better quality opposition, unfortunately.
Don't worry, Alan. I never suspected for a second you'd give a man of the match based on sentiment. I know you too well at this point to suspect anything else. James, looking at the rest of the team to round out our discussion on the Raith Rovers match, there was a few sort of changes and that I enjoyed. I love Luke McCowan. If it wasn't for the midfield that we have, I would be a lot more keen to get him in the starting lineup. But it's just the luxury of having so many players in that position that we can use. Dane Murray, to be honest, I thought might not make another appearance in a Celtic shirt after the previous one. So it was good to see him kind of get his confidence back a little bit. But it was interesting as well to see Sinisalo, the goalkeeper, not somebody we've had a big chance to see much of since Kasper Schmeichel came in. And I guess my question for you is, with Sinisalo specifically, how do we keep a guy like him, who's not exactly a young player, how do we keep a guy like him satisfied with the odd appearance here and there behind Schmeichel, when I think, based on what I saw, although he didn't have very much to do, he certainly seems like a decent quality keeper and somebody that, would be a suitable sort of successor to Schmeichel post 2026?
Well, I think that, again, given the competitive landscape for the remainder of the season, he should be getting material minutes, not only because you want to see how good he is, but also and developmentally, but also from a risk management perspective. I mean, as you head into next season, we know what Schmeichel's going to be, what he is. There's the risk kind of around his age and his potential decline curve. But again, that's kind of knowable within a reasonable range. Sinisalo, it's kind of a hypothesis. I've been pretty high on him. What I've seen of him before we signed him was pretty exciting. I haven't seen anything yet that's material. I mean, again, there's no sample size to speak of, but just kind of, I know I shouldn't be saying this, but based on the eye test, like he looks like a guy. His movement, his kind of profile, his fluidity and movement, I think is quite exciting. He might have the worst instincts on aerial balls in the history of man. I have no idea, but so far he looks like a player, as I say. So I'd like to see more of him because of those factors. And it's not a long-term solution to have Kasper Schmeichel as the number one by definition, unless we're going to make a horrible decision and eat his last couple of seasons when he shouldn't be at a club of our stature. So, yeah, I mean, 5 games, 7. I mean, something meaningful out of the remaining, games, and give him a test. Let him play at Tynecastle again. The league's over, right? I mean, it's pretty much a done deal. So the idea that we can't take some of those risks to test some of these players, I think, would be, kind of silly within that context, particularly post split and/or when we get the finality of it being arithmetically clinched. So whether that'll happen, I'm pretty skeptical. It doesn't seem to have been something all that prominent within how Celtic have run things in recent years. But I always keep that hope, that latent hope that they'll turn the corner on these things.
Latent hope, it's what we all live on, I'm sure. Alan, what's your thoughts on James's assessment there, that we should take more risks in terms of selections and we should give more minutes to some of the players that haven't been getting them so far because we are in the position we're in the league?
I mean, not surprise anyone that I have exactly the same view on the goalkeeping situation from a risk perspective, and we'll go on to have I think, a bit of a conversation about goalkeepers and the upcoming tie tomorrow, because I think it's a very relevant conversation to have. So yeah, absolutely, he needs to be given minutes, and because Kasper Schmeichel, as I say, could actually, in theory, he could regress quite quickly next season, going into his 39th, 40th year, right? So that's something we have to kind of anticipate almost. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it would be very odd if there wasn't some kind of regression, even from where he has been this season, which has been excellent. And as I say, the way he rates at Champions League level is been one of the highlights of the season, actually. Really. So I don't suspect he's going to collapse completely from that, but we saw with Alan McGregor that he did, and so Alan McGregor's probably was a kind of more a slighter, less thick-set guy than Schmeichel, and to me,
what are you trying to say, Alan? Those of us that have that kind of profile, we're very sensitive.
That was thick with two C's, thick with two.
Yeah, you can't help your body shape, but and then you can't help, therefore your regression. It's not your fault. Don't don't take it personally. It's just genetics, right?
Yeah, sure.
So and then it looks to me as if Dane Murray is now fourth choice centre back, right? And we know that Carter Vickers has got reoccurring, injury issues that flare up. So if he's the second choice right sided centre back, then give him minutes. Give him minutes. The guy looks like he's put on some considerable muscle from when he was like much younger. He's 6'4". He had the confidence to absolutely dominate the ball. And I know, you might say home to Raith Rovers, but the guy, when was the last time he played a game for Celtic? See, and he completed something like nearly 150 passes, or more, 166 passes in the game. Now I know the vast majority of them were safe. And what have you, but he took responsibility. He was the ball dominant player in that Celtic team on the day, which for a young kid making his third or fourth appearance is quite something. So let's give him a chance. And there's no, as James said, there's no reason why that can't happen between now and the end of the season.
Yeah, 100%. I really hope he takes the opportunities he's given, because I think there's something there for him, and if he can remain as a bit more free of injury than Stephen Welsh has over the years, then it's possible that we've got, as James said, a player on our hands. Alan, I'll come back to you before we move on to talk about the Champions League. Now, I usually pride myself on my ability to link between what we've been talking about before, what we're talking about after, and the subject therein. Andy, who everybody knows I have christened Backroom Andy, texted the group chat and said one of the topics we would talk about was accounts. I'm going to be completely honest. Out of pure fear of numbers and anything like that, as anybody who knows me well will tell you, I don't know anything about accounts or what he was referring to. So do you want to maybe fill me in on exactly what's going on here and why it's of any particular interest to the listening and viewing public?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously, since about 2008, football finance has become far more interesting than actually what happens on the pitch. We all know this, right? And I'm sure a lot of our listeners tune in just for that. So so Celtic's interims were released, which is the 6 month view from the end of June to the end of December 2024. So it gives that snapshot as at the club's financial position at that point in time. And again, the numbers were hugely encouraging in terms of even at a European level, Celtic would be the envy of most finance directors in terms of their financial position. It's an extremely strong position to be in. They're making very healthy profits, which few football clubs do. They have significant monies in the bank, over 60 million. They have a fluid player trading model, and I think we'll maybe get onto that with James a bit later in terms of yes, that's all true, but could it be better? Absolutely. And it's just a very well run football club from that perspective. In fact, there's very few football clubs in Europe who probably have a healthier financial position without being pumped full of TV money, which Celtic obviously are not, other than a bit from the European table, as it were. A little bit complicated this year because whereas in previous seasons Champions League money would have been kind of reflected in front loaded into that first 6 months. Not all that revenue has been seen. We had 2 games post 31st cut off, and obviously we're going to have 2 more games in the playoff round, and so UEFA tend to pay out the money as it accrues, post the events, not pre-event. So, there's some additional revenue to come. Oftentimes, clubs look very healthy by the big end of December because they have only had 6 months of season ticket money that they've actually spent. You tend to reflect the season book money as and when the games accrue. So, as in, the season ticket money is reflected as being, spent essentially when people, attend the game. And therefore, what it means is in the second half of the season, it doesn't look like you basically make a bit of a loss because that's when you tend to be just spending money and not getting any new income in, given that you're not going to get any new season book money, etc. And you're probably out of Europe at that point if you're Celtic. So, but this season's going to be a bit different. So for that reason, but it's all looking very similar to last year, really, in terms of record. Record revenues, turnover, etc. So all very positive. Really, is the very high level highlights, and probably James can give you a slightly more, or significantly more expert view on it. But yeah.
Yeah, James, you're the guy to come to when talking about all this stuff. I mean, it is important to say, without sounding like too much of a happy clapper, that we don't need to look too far south of the River Clyde to see what can happen when you don't manage things as well. And as much as supporters, we are clamouring for the next big signing and the chequebook to be whipped out, and as necessary as that sometimes is, it is encouraging to see that the people at the top are managing the club in a way that will make sure it's sustainable and continues to be a going concern. That is the only thing I've learned from my accountant dad over the years in terms of financially appropriate terms. But there you go.
Yeah, we've actually talked about hypothetically, and I don't think it's a legitimate risk because of Dermot Desmond's commitment to retaining his ownership. But as an operating company, it's overcapitalized. I mean, there's too much capital being retained in cash relative to the size of the business. So normally, what happens in the ocean of sharks of capitalism is those type of overcapitalized companies get gobbled up somehow and stripped of their assets by those ruthless capitalists. So so it's a question of what to do with it. I know, Harry Brady on Celtic Underground's written some really interesting stuff about stadium upgrades and using that as a base platform of capital to then invest it in redoing the main stand and the corporate suites and, kind of polishing up the way that you create revenue from corporate sponsorship and season ticket, luxury suites, that kind of thing. So all of that, I think, could and probably should be on the table. And that's the position we're in. Now, this goes back to the culture of, at what point do you transcend from hyper conservative, which, understandably coming out of kind of the dipsy do coming out of the Fergus McCann, and then got a little hairy for a little bit. And then that's when Mr. Lawwell's brought in and a little bit more austerity to get through the rough patch and then really set the glide path of where we're at now. So how do you kind of walk back from that and say, okay, we're going to put a little bit of risk, we're going to take on a little bit of debt, not a lot, but responsible amounts of debt in order to finance investment in infrastructure, that kind of thing. That's the other thing I will add is that they have been doing Barrowland. I mean, that was in the accounts that they've ramped up infrastructure spending. That's why I think some people were surprised with, on a relative basis, how low the cash was. People keep waiting for that 100 million or 90 to 100 million line item on the cash to print. And the other thing I'll say, and again, this is for the true accounting nerds. There's been some volatility in how working capital's been used. I'll put it that way. So the accountants will know what that means. And if you want to, bump up the way you look on your accounts, or maybe manage expectations a little bit in a certain way. There are some ways that you can accelerate how fast you pay your bills, or ask payment terms that are less extended for receivables, that kind of thing, and that can make your cash look different than it otherwise would be. I'm not saying that's happened, but it wouldn't be a shocker.
Who doesn't? Who doesn't?
Right. Well, that's right. This is all the normal course. Human beings respond to incentives. So I get why it might happen, and it's not anything shady or anything. But the last two interim reports have had some, I'd say, higher than historically range of kind of the movement in those working capital. But that's the only kind of interesting thing. And the only people that find that interesting, maybe your dad would find that interesting, Laura. People that
I'm sure he would, yeah.
Yeah, actually care about accounting. And I actually don't. I don't like accounting all that much, but it's kind of a necessary evil at times. But so yeah, other than that, well, everything that Alan said, I mean, I suspect the second half will surprise expectations because of these. We're in this transition phase in the Champions League, and those will not be, with two home fixtures, the delayed kind of payment in some of the we'll call it the core Champions League money, that could be material, in the millions, and that'll kind of bump up in to the second half of the season. And to Alan's point, it's not going to change the relative equation on, the second half usually being much less prosperous than the first half. But relative to other second halves, I suspect it will be materially better. And that we might,
James, we also brought in around, and I know you don't get the money now, it's over a number of tranches, but we brought in around 15 million in players sold in January, and obviously spent 9 million on Jota, so and a bit loan money for Schlupp or what have you. So that again is not reflected in these accounts. Sorry.
Exactly. Yeah. No, so it'll be fun to see what the working capital looks like as we go into 6:30, depending on how the rest of the season goes. Maybe if we finish the treble and they line up a striker to be signed on the first day of the window, then maybe they'll print 95 million in cash or something like that.
What I'm taking from that, on you go, Alan. Sorry,
Laura. No, just going to say, listen, it's always fun at this time to have a laugh about this, right? So James mentioned, I think yourself mentioned Fergus McCann there, and the thing that Fergus McCann did, he did many things, but one of the things he did was he resisted the clamour to do what the Rangers have been doing for the last 10 years, which is spend money, any money. Don't to quote, to misquote Chris Boyd. Don't care where it comes from, just get it spent, right? To keep up with an opponent that's far better resourced. But we know the reasons why they were far better resourced now. They weren't apparent at the time, but we know now. But anyway. And Fergus McCann refused. He had a business plan. He had a model he wanted to build the club up to sort the major problems first, then put it on a sustainable basis, and then grow from there. And that's the right way to do it. And we are all reaping the dividends of what Fergus McCann put in place, and it's taken 30 odd years to be an overnight success, right? As the old cliche goes. And this is the problem they've got at the other end of the city, is they've overspent, overcommitted to keep up with a massively more resourced opponent in Celtic. And all this gnashing and wailing of teeth around why can't they sack Clement? It isn't complicated, right? It's really, really simple. The guy is on a huge amount of money. He's on a long contract, and they can't afford to sack him. They can't afford to sack him because they don't have enough money. Why don't they have enough money? Because they've spent their shareholders, investors, or whatever you want to call them, and people that are on the board have spent loads of their own money to cover losses that they've endured to keep up with Celtic. And I can't speak for the individuals and their circumstances, but these are not kind of Arab sheikh type oil billionaire wealthy people. They're very wealthy individuals, and they're definitely fans, so credit to them. But there comes a point when, especially as the money that they put in isn't even, they can't even spend it on footballers anymore because it's not reflected as football income anymore. So essentially, you're just basically trying to cover up a huge black hole. That's all you're doing to keep the show on the road, for a bunch of people that hate you and would run you out of town if they could. So that kind of propping up of an unsustainable business is being walked back now. And UEFA are watching, and they insist that you run yourself on a sustainable basis. So these are very prosaic reasons why that club is in the situation it is. And it's not complicated, it's not a Fenian conspiracy, and it's not, all the weird and wonderful reasons why, they're dreaming up about why Clement can't be sacked and all this sort of thing. It all comes down to money or lack of. And now it's austerity because they have to put the club on a sustainable basis because the owners demand it and UEFA demands it. It's that prosaic. It's that boring. But it's a very painful truth for some people to acknowledge.
James, I love it. I love it when you just let Alan just wax lyrical about whatever he sees fit to wax lyrical about. I just love it. Bearing in mind that my understanding of what you had said before Alan went on to his thing was basically in terms of finances, Celtic have, if Celtic are the financial trousers, they have stuff to sock down there. It might still be impressive, but we'll never know because they've bumped it up a little bit,
Well, we've all done that, right now. So it's a human thing to do. And one thing I'll add, I wrote a piece doing benchmarking, kind of updating the transfer window on player trading, and that led to I was watching Axom Monday morning my time. And Paul John.
Who? Sorry.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
If you can do it, Laura, we can.
I love you, Axon guys. Like, let's not start a Twitter beef. I do love those guys. I actually was catching up with Paul John a while ago. But anyway, back to your story. Sorry.
Yeah, Paul John referenced Partizan Belgrade within the context of talking about Queen's Park, given the illustrious result over the weekend, and that sprung up, the old light bulb going off on the head. I'm like, I should look into that more. So I'm going to write a follow-up piece, and the reason I'm getting into this is because I think it's analogous to what's going on with Celtic and Rangers, this opening gap of the financial aspect, and I think the relationship between Partizan and Red Star in the last decade might give us some better inclination as far as what the future beholds and the competitive dynamics. And just giving, I think it's 7 leagues in a row. Red Star have won 4 cups. I think they only have 1 cup competition, but the gap that they're opening up, and now Partizan, it hasn't been shareholders, but they have something like 40 million in debt. And now they're getting constricted with UEFA roles. And now they're struggling to qualify even for Europa League because they've had to shrink their wage budget. And it's just opening up this gap. Stadium sizes are different. So there's a lot of, as with any analogy, you could say a zebra is like a horse. Doesn't make it a horse. It's nothing like a horse, actually, other than it kind of looks like a horse. So analogies are never perfect. But I'll probably do a follow-up column for subscribers this week to kind of get into it, because we're not unique in this sense. There are other kind of parallels in some other leagues as these gaps open up when some clubs get Champions League money and kind of the number 2 size club starts to struggle, and you get that for a couple of seasons, 3 seasons in a row, and all of a sudden it really starts to open up.
Yeah, so Nick Harris wrote about this on his Sporting Intelligence Substack about how the Champions League really benefits clubs like, and he specifically talked about Celtic, a dominant club in a small league, because it absolutely cements and grows the already enormous gap between them and the rest of the league. Now, that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing in general terms. It's not even a good thing for Celtic in some respects, especially if the status quo remains. But what I wanted to talk about is, just before we all get too giddy, including myself, is that the thrust. So I'm put words into James's mouth, but wasn't the thrust of the article that James wrote on the benchmarking. But one of the consequences that you should have taken out of it had you read it is that, for all of Celtic's advantages, and we've seen that in the accounts that have just been released, and we see that, the humiliation of a club across the city that can't even afford to sack its manager. I mean, that is a humiliating position to be in, really. Is that we can't be complacent. And the reason that we can't be complacent is that Celtic aren't performing very well in player trading. You might think that they're doing great if all you look at is the SPFL, but on a European, in the European context, we're not performing that well. And if the Rangers ever got their selves together and started to become a really effective player trading operation, given that it would be almost impossible for them to not finish second, given the paucity of resources and frankly talent in the boardrooms of the rest of the clubs in the league, then they could in theory take advantage of Celtic's relative inefficiency in the transfer market to bridge that gap. But that would probably require them to be taken over by a kind of Tony Bloom type operation. So the good news for Celtic is that it's almost unfeasible for anyone to buy that club, given the ownership structure and the amount of money it would take to do it. It's almost unfeasible. So, but we should be vigilant, and we should look to be improving, as we've talked about endlessly, our scouting, our recruitment, and our market intelligence above all else, our understanding of the market dynamics.
Yeah, it's a thing that I think a lot of us kind of scream out at Celtic. The time to put your foot down and really put pedal to the metal is when you're already way out in front in the race, and that makes it even more difficult for your opponents to catch up with you. Our problem has always been that regardless of what you were talking about there, Fergus McCann refusing to go by what Rangers was doing, I do ultimately feel that it appears that the current boardroom are dictated to by what Rangers do, and as long as we're slightly ahead of them, then they're quite happy with that, despite us being #we're not half of anything or whatever it was that we tweeted that day.
I wouldn't agree with that, Laura. I honestly wouldn't agree with that. I think it's more prosaic again than that. It's simply the fact that we're not conditioned to understanding the market that we operate in because we think we're doing a great job. And actually, we're measuring ourselves, as we've said so many times, it's the wrong KPIs in the wrong context that we're measuring ourselves against and have a completely false perspective on our performance. It should be a European view on performance, not a domestic view.
Yeah, and that's what I mentioned. Red Star have not been lighting up Europe in recent years. They're not kind of broadly considered to be one of the more progressively run of the, let's call it, old-time elite clubs that have been in these smaller leagues and then struggle as the finances in Europe start to get stretched. They have started to become dominant domestically because the number 2 club has started to fall off the cliff. And the gap in finances has just opened up to a degree. It's structural. So it's, what basically the point of my piece is not only the benchmarking, but this idea of misaligning the competence or the contribution of what the club has done from a player trading model perspective relative to other revenue sources and that type of thing. So it's all about vulnerability. And ultimately, this is where Europe has been the measuring stick. How have you competed in Europe? And I think this is a perfect week for this because of the juxtaposition of coming off of these 3 games where we completely obliterated domestic opposition, and then squaring down, a game where we're the minnow on a relative basis, and these dynamics on the disparity in resources are, structurally important and not unique to Celtic and Scotland. But that doesn't make them, it is endemic. It is the most important aspect on an attribution perspective.
Yeah, all very interesting stuff to read. Alan, I really liked that you mentioned Nick Harris's Substack. That's one I really enjoy reading. Anybody listening to this, if you haven't already, the Huddle Breakdowns on Substack, there's some exclusive content there, and in terms of podcasts that you can get if you subscribe to our platforms. So I would really encourage that you go and read that. You'll get James' piece, you'll get Alan's frequent writings, and it really is a fantastic platform. It's a bit like old school Twitter before it went the way it went, where you could find all these fascinating blogs. And I think, Alan, you and I used to talk about, you used to like to find blogs about how many corner flags fell over in a 90 minutes or something like that. Just sort of really niche stuff that not everybody would enjoy, but certainly there's an audience there for. There's that stuff that you used to always find on Twitter is there on Substack, and so are we. So I'd encourage anybody to sort of subscribe to that and get that content. Alan, I'll come to you first. James mentioned it there, and it seems like a good time to start talking about it. We are obviously up against German giants, as they're often billed, Bayern Munich, tomorrow night at the time of recording. Some people will be listening to this after that match, so who knows how we'll have got on. Brendan Rodgers said earlier today that he thinks we have the capability to hurt Bayern Munich, and I've seen a lot of people getting very overexcited about the number of injuries they've got, and the usual nonsense
that look on Alan's face. We got
yeah, the usual stuff that befalls us as we naively enter into another Lions Den. What's your opinion on our chances and what we're going to face against Bayern tomorrow night?
So I must have missed this. So it's Olise, Gnabry, Coleman, Musiala. They're all injured, really? Sane. Are they all injured?
Harry Kane.
Davis.
Portuguese international left back who's the backup.
Yeah. I might get excited if they're all out, but oh boy. So this is going to be interesting.
Maybe their flight will get delayed, Alan. They're going to reroute their flight to Ireland by accident or something.
We'll get a 3-0, they'll turn up late or whatever. Yeah, so the way I'd position this is we're going to play a team that stylistically, and I'm, again, to use James's point, I'm going to oversimplify here because it isn't as simple as this, but broad strokes, plays a very, very similar style of football to Celtic, right? So this is we talk about matchups. This is two teams that play broadly very similar styles of play, but of course they do it a lot better than we do, right? So now that there's good news, there's a lot of bad news, and there's some good news in all of that, right? So they will do things. We've talked about how high Celtic play, how high their line is. Domestically, it's almost a halfway line. It's a little bit deeper in Champions League games by a couple of meters. Oh boy, this is about almost in your half, right? Is their average positioning, average defensive position
with Neuer 20 yards behind him.
Neuer, who's 39 years old, plays about 36 meters on average, right? This team will squeeze the play, and Celtic have been very admirable in the Champions League. Actually, one of the best, most effective pressing teams in the competition. But this is the best pressing team in the competition, both by volume of pressures and by effectiveness. So, they, in terms of pressures, they'll regain the ball about a quarter from every pressure, whereas with us, it's just under a fifth. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it is in terms of if you were to rank the teams in the competition. So this is a pressing machine. Everything they do at very high pace, and they have got a lot of very quick players, including the 5 attacking midfielders that I mentioned and the fullbacks. Oh, and the centre-backs aren't too slow either, by the way. There's only really Harry Kane and Neuer that you wouldn't call quick. So this is, and they play a very high controlling possession-based game. They have more possession than Celtic do in the Champions League and have more possessions. So very, very similar style of play. So that suggests to me that you do not go or try to go toe-to-toe with this team and try and have effectively a like-for-like basketball match. We will get absolutely torn apart if we try to do that. The good news is, We've seen teams set up against Celtic to counter this style of play and do so quite effectively. It can be done. And something like the Bruges model of how they set up would not be a bad idea tomorrow night to do something very similar. Is don't go chasing them in their own half, retreat to the halfway line, be very compact, and then be ready to pounce. Because the good news is they will be vulnerable to counterattacks. They do give up a lot of chances on the counter, and if we can play the perfect counter-attacking game, then we do have a chance. But given that they take about more than 2 times the number of shots that we do, and they concede less than half the number of shots that we do, Celtic will have to play the perfect counter-attacking game. And as I say, we're going to have to adjust how we play. We can't take them on toe for toe. The other thing I would say in terms of what would give us hope. I come back to what I mentioned earlier, which is the goalkeeper. So, as with last season, where we had Joe Hart, who was sadly, by the kind of key metrics, the worst of the 32 goalkeepers in the group stages. Neuer is pretty much the worst goalkeeper in the group stages this year. He's 39 years old now, and I know you might think, well, Manuel Neuer, he was at one point the best goalkeeper in the world. Yeah, but he's 39, and he's playing in a team that asks him to play 36 meters from his own goal for most of the match, right? And his stats bomb OBV is minus 0.41, which is terrible, right? He's been saving 12% less shots than expected. And we talk about, I've talked to you in the past about the stats bomb positioning error metric, which is, how far from perfect position is the goalkeeper on average when facing a shot. And again, whereas Schmeichel's one of the best in the tournament with an average positioning error of 1.42 meters, Neuer's is 2.31. So, there is hope there. If Neuer has a bad day, and he's been having them at this level of football, if we can be patient and diligent in a sort of mid-block, and if we can time our counter-attacks, and we know that we've got the pace up front, so it's a matter of playing those balls accurately over fullbacks that will bomb on, over attacking midfielders that will be flying forward as quickly as possible, then there is hope there, but we're going to have to adjust how we play.
Yeah, James, a big part of that whole consideration, as Alan said, counter-attacking is perhaps going to hold the key to any success that we might have against Bayern. A big factor of any counter-attacking game that we will play will be Dyson Maeda. I'm sure everybody who's listening to this knows, but following an appeal, which, to be honest, I didn't even realise was happening, he has had his suspension reduced and is considered to have completed that suspension because he's already served a 1-match ban. So he will be available tomorrow night and next week for the return leg against Bayern as well. I guess what my question comes round to is, how likely do you think it is that we are going to cater to Maeda and the counter-attacking game that Alan mentioned? Or does Brendan have the ego about him to try and go toe-to-toe with Bayern the way he did against Dortmund, even though he insisted that isn't what he did?
I hope it's a cat and mouse game where he's trying to play mind games going into it, because I went back and rewatched the Feyenoord 3-0 victory over Bayern Munich at Feyenoord in the league phase, and it was the most horrifying 3-0 defeat I have ever watched. It was everything that Alan spoke about statistically. Like, their pressing data is not just the best, it's orders of magnitude. Like, they are detached in most of their pressing metrics from everybody else. And again, I haven't watched all of the games, but in watching, Feyenoord could not get out. I mean, every time they tried to do anything other than just launch the ball, it was a matter of seconds until they lost possession. And their keeper had a tremendous game, had some terrific saves. I mean, it could have very easily have been 3-0 the other way had that not happened. And how they scored was basically high balls over the top, launching them. And so we absolutely have that recipe. Arne Engels is very good at delivering those. Hatate can deliver those. And we have the people with the pace in order, even with their top-notch pace. I mean, we've got elite pace in Kuhn and Maeda to be able to get in behind. And Neuer is not as nimble as he used to be. And I think the way they play is almost like a tweener between what I thought we were getting when Ange arrived, because that was the prescription of, you heard all the journalists in Japan were like, oh, he's a maniac. He plays his keeper at halfway line and, as an actual sweeper. And when we signed Hart, that kind of went by the wayside. So that's kind of how they play. It's almost like that authentic Ange ball from Japan that we thought we might be getting. But that leaves gaps in transition. But I don't think so. This is the horrifying part. This is why I said it was the most horrifying 3-0. They man mark, right? So they've got that part that, they Aston. I was worried that Aston Villa might do it with their athletes and their size and pace. They didn't. They kind of stayed with their more passive, well coached and well designed, but not one that stress tests our relative weakness. These guys man mark in their press. So I don't think. And I don't think our build-up play with the relative weaknesses within the context of man marking, I think this is a nightmare matchup, quite frankly, in that aspect of play. So if we try to build out from the back, I think it's going to go really bad. And the idea that Ida is going to be some hold-up keeper against their center backs with the intensity of pressure that their midfield places on this man marking, I don't see that happening. So I think long over the top is going to be the recipe. That's not a high probability strategy. That was not a normal 3-0 outcome that Feyenoord was able to get. It could have gone horribly wrong for them. But I think it's probably our best chance, and hope that Schmeichel has, a terrific game, because they are absolutely going to bombard our goal. I mean, go back and watch the game. They were camped within 40 yards of Feyenoord's goal and just barraging, and they could not get out. I mean, it's like the Atalanta game, only with better players, is what I'm expecting. I mean, they basically had 80% possession at Feyenoord. And again, Feyenoord's kind of a comp for us. They're right in that little neighborhood as far as quality of players overall. So yeah, that's what I'm. So I hope we mimic that kind of strategy. Whether we do or not, I think that'll be interesting. And that's the horrible thing about this. Back to this issue of disparity. It's such a gap between us and them that we can do all of that, play the perfect game, and still lose 5-0. That's how good they are.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's worrying me now, having listened to you guys talk, is it sounds like chances for us are obviously going to be few and far between, and our ability to take chances when there are so few of them is something that concerns me. So,
but they could be really good. They squeeze the game so much, even in the Bundesliga. They have one of the highest XG per shot conceded in the league. They just don't concede that many. So that when you do get them against them, they're usually like freight train breakaways. Again, if you think about, we also experienced some of that with Ange ball. I mean, that, on the rare occasions when domestic opponents had the quality to be able to counter, you usually get like 1v1 against the keepers, that kind of thing. And that's the recipe. We're going to have to take those chances. It might only be a few of them. They'll be really high quality, but we'll have to finish them. And it's possible. I mean, so I agree with Rogers in the sense that there's a pathway here. Like, I don't think, I don't think it's hopeless. But it's kind of a scary dynamic, is because this is all assuming we don't make horrible mistakes or we don't try to build out from the back, right? So,
he said it, Alan. He said it. Oh no.
That Hatate doesn't play a blind reverse pass and build up right to Musiala with Coleman blitzing in from the left. Like there's, so
for Adeyemi, read Musiala. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the ironic thing is, as James has said, they've got one of the highest XG per shots against in the competition, because when teams do break out, there's not a lot of cover defence. And secondly, they've got one of the lowest XGs per shot forward, because the way that they play, you've got no choice but to fall back into your own box, and therefore many of the shots they get are in front of a kind of packed defense. So they kind of manufacture this, but it's the volume. They generate a lot of shots, so they don't concede many. So someone's done some pretty neat risk planning around that, right? To say, and it comes back to trade-offs that I was talking about the other week there. We'll accept that sometimes you've got like a one-on-one with Neuer on the basis that you might only get one or half of one every game. And the way that we play, we're going to generate 4 or 5 transition shots, and accept the fact that we might have 10 that are rubbish, but we'll have 3 or 4 that are really good. And I'll take that trade-off. That's really what the strategy. Now, whether someone's looked at it in exactly that way, I don't know. But it's probably more intuitive than that from a footballing perspective. But that's essentially, I think, what they've done.
Yeah, well, to anybody listening or watching this, in the couple of hours you might have to spare before the game, by the time this comes out, you can either do what I'm going to do, which is go in with blind ignorance and hope for the best, or you can watch that Feyenoord game and then fret the hours away until kickoff and see how it goes. Either way, the result will be the result, and we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Alan, James, it's been a pleasure as always. Obviously, you guys will cover the outcome of the first leg of the Bayern tie in the podcast at the end of the week, which usually comes out on a Friday. And as I said before, to anybody who's watching or listening and hasn't done so already, please consider subscribing to the platform, because there's so much good content up there and exclusive stuff for those who are able to do so. Alan, James, thank you for joining me again, and we'll see you all again next week.